Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar on addressing access and functional needs in school and higher education emergency operations plans.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Myers, and I'm the Director of Research and Development at the Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools Technical Assistance Center, also known as the REMS TA Center. I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar, Addressing Access and Functional Needs in School and Higher Education Emergency Operations Plans. This webinar will provide an overview of how to incorporate the access and functional needs, also called AFN, of students, staff, visitors, and others in school and IHE emergency operations plans, EOPs, and other emergency preparedness activities. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the REMS TA Center's website via our webinars page, along with an accompanying resources list following this event. Before we start, we have a few brief housekeeping items to cover. Next slide, please. To download a copy of the presentation slides and other pertinent handouts, use the handouts or downloads box on the right-hand side of your screen. Select the name of the handout you would like to review and click the Download Files button. You can also download the resource list that I just referenced using the same steps. As a reminder, there is no dial-in for this webinar. Audio is available via the link provided. If you're experiencing difficulty hearing the audio stream, please turn up your computer speaker volume at this time. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please contact the REMS TA Center at info@remstacenter.org. You may also request technical assistance using the Q&A tool on your screen. Questions are viewable to the webinar moderator only. If you would like to submit questions during the question and answer portion of this webinar and not able to do so via the box provided via Adobe Connect, please email your questions again to info@remstacenter.org. Next slide. Finally, to ask a question, use the Q&A tool on the right side of your screen to send your message to the facilitator. Questions will be answered in the order in which they appear and as time permits following the presentation. Again, if you would like to submit questions during the question and answer portion of this webinar and are unable to do so via the box provided via Adobe Connect, please email your questions to info@remstacenter.org. Next slide. Let's first take a look at the agenda of today's webinar. We will begin with a brief introduction of the topic, which will include details on how many students in the United States have disabilities or access and functional needs, some unique needs that should be considered by schools and IHEs in their preparedness efforts, and how to address the needs of the AFN community in emergency operations plans. Our guest presenters will then provide a broad overview of considerations for AFN integration within schools and IHEs. This will include more detailed information and descriptions of case studies exhibiting AFN integration within schools and IHEs. We'll close with a question and answer session, during which you will have the opportunity to ask our guest presenters questions. I would now like to take a moment to introduce our three presenters today. Louis Vance Taylor is the Chief of the Office of Access and Functional Needs at the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. Vance is responsible for ensuring the needs of individuals with disabilities and persons with access and functional needs are identified before, during, and after a disaster, and then integrated within the state's emergency management systems. Born and raised in San Francisco Bay Area, Vance was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy as a child and uses a power chair. He has worked in Washington, D.C. as an advisor to two different members of Congress, directed security policy at the National Association, and was a principal at a top-ranked Homeland Security and Emergency Management consulting firm, Catalyst Partners, LLC. Vance is a nationally recognized public speaker and advocate for individuals with disabilities. He has a master's degree in Homeland Security from the University of Connecticut and an undergraduate degree from Brigham Young University in Communications. Next, Jill Barnes is a coordinator in the Office of Emergency Services for the Los Angeles Unified School District, or LAUSD, where she supports schools and the district with emergency response needs. She advises schools on emergency procedures, supplies, and the school safety plan, writes and produces emergency online training courses for school personnel, manages the Emergency Operations Center, and acts as a liaison to government and community agencies during emergencies. Dr. Barnes is a former police officer with the Los Angeles Police Department and a former public information officer for the Santa Monica Fire Department. She has also worked as a middle school teacher, school site coordinator, and dean of student discipline in LAUSD. She holds degrees from University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA, the University of Michigan, University of California, Irvine, and California State University, Northridge, and has completed supplemental coursework at Harvard University. And Anne-Marie McLaughlin is the Emergency Manager at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, also known as UMass Boston. Her responsibilities include emergency preparedness and business continuity planning. She directs emergency preparedness exercises and training sessions for the university and regularly participates in regional exercises. She has presented on business continuity planning, crisis communications, inclusive preparedness, and exercise planning, and a special interest in social media for emergency management and inclusive planning relative to people with access and functional needs. Before working in emergency management, she spent a decade working in communications and social and media relations at UMass Boston and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. She holds a Master Exercise Practitioner certificate from the Federal Emergency Management Agencies, or FEMA's, Emergency Management Institute, a Master's in English Composition for UMass Boston, a Master's of Business Continuity from Norwich University, and a Certificate in Collaborative Leadership in Homeland Security from the University of Connecticut. Next slide. Vance will be providing us with a definition of access and functional needs in just a moment. However, it is worth pointing out that, according to the U.S. Department of Education, also known as ED, approximately 12% of students in K-12 schools have a disability that requires the support of a special education program. 11% of undergraduate students report having a disability, and 9% of students in public schools are English language learners, ELL, or students who participate in programs of language assistance such as English as a second language. Therefore, approximately 1 in 10 of your students may have a disability or access or functional need. Next slide. Types of disabilities and access and functional needs include sensory, including individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, blind or visually impaired, cognitive or developmental, such as autism, speech or language, physical, such as asthma, and social, emotional, behavioral, which could include disorders such as attachment disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. However, these are just a few examples of the many types of disabilities and access and functional needs. In addition, there is a broad range of disabilities and access and functional needs. The manifestation of a disability ranges from mild to severe. A mild disability may not be apparent and cause no significant effect on the functioning of the student. A temporary condition, such as a broken leg, is not considered a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. Regardless, schools and IHEs should always consider how temporary disabilities will be accommodated during an emergency event and include such considerations in their EOPs. It is not uncommon for some students to have several related disabilities. Emergency planning efforts, including the creation of EOPs, must consider these types of disabilities and access and functional needs and how to address them. We'll go into more detail in the next few slides. Next slide, please. You're likely familiar with the Guide for Developing High-Quality School Emergency Operations Plans, also known as the School Guide, and the Guide for Developing High-Quality Emergency Operations Plans for Institutions of Higher Education, known as the IHE Guide, which are available on the REMS TA Center's website for download. As a reminder, these guides were created by the U.S. Department of Education, Justice, or DOJ, led by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, Homeland Security, DHS, led by FEMA, and Health and Human Services, or HHS, in response to the President's 2013 and Now is the Time plan. Both guides list several key planning principles that are central to developing a high-quality school or IHE EOP. The principles for school EOP planning, which are shown on your screen, include: number 1, planning must be supported by leadership. 2, creating and revising an EOP is done by following a collaborative process. 3, planning uses assessments to customize plans to the building level. 4, planning considers all threats and hazards through an all-hazards approach. 5, planning provides for the needs of the whole community. In this instance, the whole community includes children, individuals with disabilities, and others with access and functional needs, those from religiously, racially, and ethnically diverse backgrounds, and people with limited English proficiency. And number 6, planning considers all settings and all times. In a few minutes, Jill Barnes' presentation will discuss addressing the needs of the AFN population in K-12 schools. Next slide. The key planning principles for IHEs are very similar, but with the addition of: planning considers the individual preparedness of students, faculty, and staff, and planning meets the requirements of all applicable laws. Please note that, as with the planning principles for schools, IHE planning must also provide for the access and functional needs of the whole community, which in this case is the IHE. We'll hear from Anne-Marie McLaughlin of UMass Boston after Jill Barnes on how to meet the needs of people with AFN in IHEs. Next. The school and IHE guides also provide a 6-step planning process for creating EOPs, revising them, or reviewing components of them. The guides point out that the needs of the AFN community need to be addressed throughout these 6 steps. For example, in step number 1, form a collaborative planning team. The planning team should include students or staff with AFN. In step 2, understand the situation. The team should ensure, for example, that pathways are wheelchair accessible as part of the site assessment. In step 3, determine goals and objectives. And step 4, plan development, identify courses of action. The planning team should determine goals and objectives and identify courses of action that integrate the needs of the entire school community, including those of students and staff with disabilities and access and functional needs. In step 5, plan preparation, review, and approval. Planners should check the written plan for compliance with applicable laws, such as federal laws, some of which Vance Taylor will be mentioned shortly, including ADA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and the Individuals with Disabilities in Emergency Preparedness Executive Order number 13347, state education codes, and local Board of Education policies. Finally, in step 6, plan implementation and maintenance. The plan is reviewed, revised, and maintained. Also, exercises are conducted which include components that address meeting the needs of persons with AFN. Next slide. When going through the 6-step planning process, the planning team will likely identify and want to address numerous access and functional needs. One place inclusive courses of action can be included in the EOP is within the functional annexes, which are critical functions or activities that apply to more than one hazard or threat. Schools and IHEs can address needs in these functional annexes: communications and warning, general responses such as evacuation and transportation, deny entry or closing, which is sometimes called lockdown, and shelter in place, accounting for all persons, reunification, recovery, and public, medical, and mental health. It is worth pointing out that this is not an exhaustive list of functional annexes. Schools and IHEs may wish to create other annexes or name their annexes differently. Our presenters today will provide examples of how access and functional needs have been integrated into some of these functional annexes, such as the communications and warning, evacuation and transportation, and lockdown annexes. Next slide. We'll now move into the second part of our webinar, which will be presented by Vance Taylor of California's OES. If you can move to the next slide. Vance, I'll hand things over to you.
All right, thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. Well, good morning, everybody, or I guess good afternoon, depending on wherever you're logging on from today. My name is Vance Taylor, as Paul said, and I have the privilege of serving as the Chief of the Office of Access and Functional Needs at the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, which is a very, very, very long title. I'm told that they would have made it longer, but they ran out of words. I'm glad to be with you here in cyberspace today, talking about access and functional needs integration within schools and IHEs. It's an important topic, and this is the perfect venue for it. Here's a quick overview of what I'm going to be covering in our time together today. We'll go over my office, define access and functional needs, discuss the value of partnerships, talk about how this specifically relates to schools and IHEs, and I'll reiterate that this entire effort takes a unified effort in order to be successful. Next slide. In the world of emergency management, we understand that no two disasters are ever the same. Even incidents of the same type vary by landscape, geography, climate, and countless other factors. Yet virtually all incidents parallel one another in at least one sobering way. They disproportionately affect individuals with disabilities and access and functional needs. We saw it in the Loma Prieta earthquake, Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, and during the Butte and Valley fires that ravaged Northern California last year. Understanding the harsh reality of how unfairly all disasters affect our communities, California did something unprecedented. In 2008, the governor leaned forward and established my office. The Office of Access and Functional Needs exists to ensure that the needs of individuals with disabilities and persons with access and functional needs are identified before, during, and after disasters, and that they're integrated into the state's emergency management systems. Next slide. Whenever we're talking about access and functional needs, I find it helpful to start with the first question that people always ask me. What is an access or functional need, or an AFN? Well, access and functional needs refer to individuals who have developmental or intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, chronic conditions, injuries, limited English proficiency, older adults, children, people in institutionalized settings, those who are low income, homeless, or transportation disadvantaged, and pregnant women. AFN refers to individuals with physical, programmatic, and communication accessibility needs before, during, and after emergencies, which is important to note as we consider how it is that we go about informing people about disasters, particularly when they may have communication barriers. And how do we talk to them about evacuating? And what resources do we provide for individuals with mobility challenges? And when we look at things like shelters and making them accessible in order to accommodate everyone's needs. Next slide. When I first came into this position, the plan was for my predecessor, who some of you may have known, Richard DeVelder, to remain on in a consulting capacity in order to assist with the transition. Well, sadly, he passed away unexpectedly a few days after I was sworn in. So on the one hand, there was this shock of tremendous loss And on the other hand, there was a tremendous loss of institutional knowledge. Knowing that disasters could strike at any moment, I worked quickly to identify where the strength of my office was and determined very quickly that it lied in our partnerships. So when the Puget Valley fires erupted 2 weeks later, I knew where to go in order to get things done. During that disaster response, we formed an AFN stakeholder work group, which consisted of our partners from independent living centers, advocacy groups, nonprofits, and we all worked together to meet the unmet needs associated with individuals that had access and functional needs. We wanted to provide survivors with access to shelters. We wanted to replace durable medical equipment and assistive technology. And in addition to doing those things, we knew we needed to provide acute disaster case management services. And together we did it. As local, state, and federal stakeholders or partners, we utilized interpreters at events and recovery centers. We provided accessible transportation and delivered power chairs, manual chairs, walkers, canes, accessible portable restrooms, showers, and all kinds of assets and resources. So coming out of that, I can tell you 100%, matter of fact, the power of partnership is real. Next slide. Now, whenever we're talking about integrating access and functional needs, whether we're talking about forest fires or specifically, we're talking about working to integrate AFN within schools and IHEs, I like to tell people a story that I think emphasizes how we get the job done. And it's a story about a knight riding into town. And the knight comes in on his horse and looks to the side of the road and sees that there's a little bird lying on its back with its feet up in the air. The knight's puzzled. So he stops, gets off and asks the bird, "Little bird, what are you doing? Why aren't you flying around with your friends having a good time, singing a song the way birds do?" And the bird looked at him and said, "I heard that the sky was going to fall. So I'm laying on my back with my feet up so I can catch it." Well, the knight thought that that was ridiculous. Little bird, he said, "You are foolish. Your legs are small and weak and feeble. Surely you cannot hold up the sky." Well, the bird thought for a second, then looked back at the knight and said, "You know, maybe you're right. Maybe I'm small and maybe my legs are weak, and some would even call them feeble. But we each do what we can." Let's go to the next slide. So we each do what we can. That means we work together to develop and maintain situational awareness. We each do what we can, which means we work together to understand the laws and policies related to students with disabilities. We look at IDEA, Section 504. We look at the ADA, which to celebrate its 26th anniversary. We look at these to understand the demographics of your student population. Right? We want to understand who's there. We want to understand the environments where students learn and participate in campus activities. Where are they going? What parts of campus do they spend their time in? Where do they have to cross to get to and from their classes? We work together to use existing documentation to inform EOPs. Now in K through 12, you can glean this information from the IEPs or Section 504 plans that can assist in preparing EOPs. In colleges and universities, you're talking about somebody that's an adult, more independent, but you can still get this done during the resident assistant process, right? Work with students to identify potential needs and resources during campus evacuations and emergency procedures. In short, we take the whole community approach to planning and use demographic information, environments, and existing documentation. We involve students, parents, guardians, teachers, professors, and support teams in identifying needs and resources during an emergency. We do so understanding that we must each do what we can. Next slide. I want to close by saying this. My office exists to ensure that access and functional needs are included within every facet of our planning. Okay, that's my role. But the success of what I do really comes through you. You see, I can include it in my plan, but you're the ones who actually integrate access and functional needs into the work. Now, know this, I will support you, empower you, encourage you. I will do all that I can to assist you in your process. But ultimately, you're the ones who will actually integrate access and functional needs within schools and IHEs. And so in that sense, I literally cannot fulfill my mission without you. So I want to say thank you for what you do, and thank you for letting me join you in this effort. Know that in me you have a resource and a partner. We're going to integrate access and functional needs within schools and IHEs, and we're going to do it together. Because in order to be successful, we each do what we can. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Vance. If we can move to the next slide. And I'd now like to hand things over to Jill Barnes of the Los Angeles Unified School District, who will discuss integration of AFN within schools. Can you move to the next slide, please? Jill, I'll hand the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Paul. So I'm going to do mine through the lens of a scenario, and this is based on an actual incident that happened at one of our schools, and actually things like this have happened a couple of times in our schools. So the driver of a passing car crashes into the exterior wall of a 3-story middle school located downtown, and it has a very diverse student body. The school has exterior hallways and stairwells, and all classrooms open directly to the outside. And one of the results of the crash is that power is out throughout the campus. The principal has everyone initially shelter in place until the situation is evaluated. She wasn't quite sure at first what had caused the crash. And then the staff and students are evacuated due to concerns about the structural integrity of the building. So the next set of slides is going to be that scenario, discussing things piece by piece. Next slide, please. So the first action that the principal took was to have everybody shelter in place until they could evaluate the concerns. So some of the things that came up for students with AFN, students with disabilities, was checking on some of the unaccompanied students that may be out and about in the school that might not have been able to hear or understand the directive to shelter in place, which in our schools we usually do over the loudspeakers of the schools. This school has a DHH, a deaf and hard of hearing class that uses ASL to communicate, and they also have a couple of classrooms with students with cognitive and intellectual disabilities. There were a couple of kids from those classrooms in the restrooms at the school, so they just needed to have somebody go and check on them just to make sure that they knew that they should be sheltering in place. The principal then checked with the nurse to see if there were any medications that needed to be delivered to classrooms in some fashion during this shelter in place so that medications could take place on schedule. And as schools do frequently in a shelter-in-place or a lockdown situation, the classrooms got their toilet buckets ready in case anybody needed to use the restroom. Because with the exterior hallways, you can't send a student out of the room to use the restroom. Now, there are a few kids that use wheelchairs on this campus, and in those classrooms, what the teachers did is they took the grab bars, or to make grab bars for the toilet bucket, they used a walker that used to belong to a student and disabled the wheels on that to create grab bars to go around the toilet bucket area. All the classrooms also had bottled water and cups for students, but they did discover that there was one student that they needed a sippy cup for that they did not have, and that was something that they then put into place into their plan after that. Next slide, please. As the power is out, there are a couple things that came up with this. That deaf and hard of hearing class has an enhanced need for lighting because, of course, they can't really communicate using ASL if they can't see. Because of that, that classroom had been provided with several flashlights, although it was quickly realized at the school that it would be better actually to even provide them with headlamps so that they can use two hands to sign as they usually do. One thing that classroom teachers did is they made sure that they checked the batteries on any assistive technology that was used by students in any of the classrooms. And that school does have a portable generator because they have a student that uses a ventilator, so they checked on the ventilator as well. And the elevator's not running, so that's going to bring up another concern. Next slide, please. Once the principal called for an evacuation, which is standard protocol for us after they had evaluated the concern, they weren't sure if the building was damaged, they wanted everybody to evacuate out to the athletic fields. However, they've got a couple of kids that use wheelchairs who are upstairs on the third floor in a science lab. Now, they can't use their elevator because there's no power. The school does have an evac chair. The school had already identified and trained rescuers ahead of time, which is the way we generally do it. I take the evac chairs out to the school, and I do a hands-on training with anybody who's been identified as a rescuer. And one of the points that we cover in that training is also to make sure that you bring the student's wheelchair down too, so that they're not sitting in the evac chair after they've been down the stairs. In the DHH classroom, there were a few students that do have hearing aids, and they use their existing protocol to turn down those hearing aids while they evacuated, because when those evacuation alarms are going off, those alarm tones can be very painful with hearing aids. The teachers then just need to remind the students to turn the hearing aids back up after the alarm has been shut off. And then for any student with any sort of access and functional need or disability, anything that the student is going to need, or even a staff member for that matter, if they're going to need it when they might be out in the yard and they could be out there for quite a while, you need to evacuate any of that equipment or supplies with those students. And so at that school, they have a couple of hooks by the door with backpacks for some of the specialized equipment. The teachers also always evacuate their classroom emergency supplies anytime they go out, including their toilet buckets. They did have a student there that used oxygen, and you just have to be very careful when you're moving oxygen, because if you knock over the tank and it hits that valve, it can kind of spin that whole oxygen tank around in a way that we wouldn't want to happen. It can be very dangerous. And then making sure that the oxygen tank is secured. In this case, they they cabled it to the fence after they brought it out. Next slide, please. One thing that comes up with building evacuation is rubble. I know at schools we do a lot of fire drills. We practice evacuation all the time, but it's different when you have stuff in your way. When there is rubble around, whether it's from an earthquake or an explosion or some other issue at the school site, it's going to do things for a couple of people with different types of disabilities. For people with limited mobility, it's going to be very difficult for them to manipulate a wheelchair or a walker over any sort of rubble. So you might have to do a little bit of rubble clearance along the route, or you may have to route people differently. It's going to be an issue if there's a lot of rubble all over. It's also a significant issue for students that are blind or have low vision, and the teacher has to make sure that they're communicating any sorts of hazards that they need to account for as they're going out. We also realized that it's an issue in that DHH classroom, which wasn't something that we'd really thought about. And that's because the DHH teacher needs to turn around and face the students while they're evacuating and walk backwards in order to sign. And the students are watching the teacher instead of watching where they're walking, because they don't have the auditory capacity to kind of multitask in that, which means they're much less aware of the rubble. And after this situation, they actually ended up moving that classroom to the first floor so that it would be a little easier anyway. Next slide, please. Once they're out on that assembly area field, there are a couple of other things that came up, and this happens especially if they're not sure when they're going to be able to go in. And for this, since they were worried about whether or not the building was still structurally intact, they knew they could be out there for quite some time. So we have, because we're in California, we do a lot of prep for earthquakes. And so all of our schools have a container, like a shipping container full of emergency supplies out on the field where kids evacuate. So at this school, as we do at all of our schools, when they have students that use wheelchairs, we have, and it's really more toilet buckets, but there's a way for them to create an accessible latrine. It also is done with the an old walker that somebody has used, so it has the grab bars, but also it's about making a larger area for that one stall so that it's big enough to include an assistant if needed. There are also students at that school that use diapers, and so they have a diapering station, which is like a large adult-sized changing table that has straps and privacy. It's not part of the first aid area by design, and the school is very good about making sure that they've got diapers in the sizes that the students need and wipes that are also stored in the emergency bin. There also is a location that's kind of near the diapering station where people can carry out some of those medical protocols that are done with some of the children that have chronic conditions. That's something also that is a need for privacy. And if the school had any students with autism, and I'm not sure that they did, what we do is we make sure that there is a quieter, can't necessarily get completely quiet when you're middle of an emergency, but a quieter location after evacuation to assemble. And then the other thing to remember about students with autism is they don't necessarily have a standard reaction to pain. So if there's a chance that they may have been injured in the emergency, just go ahead and check them for injuries. Next slide. In terms of communications and warning, you want to make sure that you've got the ability at your schools to send messages to your parents and staff using mobile devices. We use Blackboard Connect at our schools, and you can use it from a cell phone, which is what we expect the principals to do and what they're very comfortable doing, so that they can send out a message to parents letting them know about the situation, even though they're not at their desk, even though they can't use their computer. Most of our messages, we have a lot of pre-staged messages so that we kind of at least have a general idea of what we need to say for various types of emergencies, and we have those pre-translated into our majority languages. We translate everything into Spanish, Chinese, Korean, and Armenian. Those are our major languages. And then it's also important to make sure that you communicate through multiple means. People don't always understand that recorded voicemail message that goes through. And if you have the capability to send the message as an email as well, or a text, then that's great too, because then you're hitting multiple modalities. Next slide, please. I think I'm done.
Thank you, Jill. In this fourth section, we're going to hear from Anne-Marie McLaughlin of UMass Boston on integration of AFN within institutions of higher education. In her presentation, Anne-Marie will discuss a personal emergency plan, and as a reminder, that resource, along with an accessible version of this presentation, is available for download from the handouts box on the right of your screen. We can move to the next slide, please.
Great. Hello, can you hear me?
Go ahead, Anne-Marie.
Great. Well, I thought I'd start out, first off, thank you for including me in this discussion. Just a little bit of information about the University of Massachusetts Boston. We're part of the 5-campus UMass system, and our waterfront campus is located just south of downtown Boston. We're a doctoral university with 17,000 enrollment, over 200 academic programs. And one of our points of pride is our great diversity of our campus population. We are very proud of our commitment to returning veterans, some of whom have access and functional needs. We have programs for lifelong learners, and we have a good number of our staff and faculty who have disabilities as well. One of our research entities is the Institute for Community Inclusion, and their entire mission is about inclusion of people with access and functional needs in the workplace, and they've been a great resource to us, and I'll talk about that later. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. When I started in this role back in 2010, our then ADA compliance officer introduced me to this, saying nothing about us without us. She was the past president of the Association for Higher Ed and Disability, and she was quite an activist, and she really inserted herself into these different phases of emergency management. Her name was Carol D'Souza. She's since retired, but happily others on our campus have stepped forward and really helped us out in terms of making sure that people with access and functional needs and representing their interests are participating. I've listed here on the slide a number of our safety and emergency preparedness committees that have representation from ADA compliance office, disability support staff, and folks from our IT department who focus on accessible technology. In addition to that, our Office of Diversity and Inclusion has an Access Advisory Committee whose main focus is access and functional needs on our campus. And on that committee, we have emergency management, environmental health and safety, public safety, et cetera, sitting in on that committee just to make sure that our network of folks focused on inclusion is maintained on our campus. Last year at the last IAEM conference, I joined the Access and Inclusion Caucus just to make sure that I was tied in with the network nationally. Basically, the advice that I would have for anybody doing emergency management in higher ed environment is to seek out like-minded people, seek out people who are passionate about inclusive preparedness, because that's where you get your ideas from and that's where you get your support from. Next slide. So one of the results of the coordination, I'm not sure why this isn't showing correctly on my screen, but if you download the document, you'll see the personal emergency plan. And this was a collaboration that we came up with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, our ADA compliance office. And what we did was we wanted to start out, not only looking at our EOP, but also looking at how we're serving our community and what kind of information do we have for our community. So it's visually inclusive in that there's a person who uses a wheelchair on the front cover, but also the preparedness information that's in the document reflects different types of disabilities. And our goal wasn't to produce a disabilities publication, but rather one that would be applicable for everyone. And these have been very popular. We actually need to reprint them. Our HR department uses them for orientation, and we give them out to students as well. Next slide. So this presentation is going to cover 3 functional annex areas as we've been working with our friends on campus who are involved in access and functional needs. We've really developed some materials and some approaches in these 3 areas. Next slide, please. So starting with evacuation and transportation, our Environmental Health and Safety Department has developed building-specific evacuation plans. And each of these plans includes a section for what they say individuals needing assistance is the language that they use. And I think it's powerful that the language in the plans assumes that the reader may be a person with access and functional needs. And it's a subtle distinction, but I think it's meaningful in terms of whole community planning. The language also talks about all people, regardless of their circumstances, need to take some responsibility for their safety. So there's this idea that although there's a network of support, there's also encouragement that people can be empowered to think actively about their safety and their survival. We have fire safety volunteers, again, trained and managed by Environmental Health and Safety, and they receive training. They direct the people with mobility disabilities to protected stairwells, and they notified police regarding locations. I should note that we're in a very urban environment. Boston Fire Department response is very good. It's around 5 minutes to our campus. And regarding evacuation chairs, currently they're used only in one of our campus buildings, the building that houses the Institute for Community Inclusion. It's a leased space. And the rationale for that is that ICI has a very high number of people with mobility issues. They have a long-standing program using these chairs. And I think that we're still looking at evacuation chairs for, in other buildings, other locations. It's being discussed given the swift response of Boston Fire and the complexity of our other campus buildings. I think it's a challenge. So it's something that we're discussing. Under lessons learned here, I think that we have discovered a need for all hazards approach. We have these plans that are excellent and they're well trained, but they're very fire scenario focused. And so back in 2011, I think it was, there was that Virginia earthquake. And we actually felt tremors here in Boston. And so people sort of panicked in an orderly fashion and evacuated. They self-evacuated. They felt buildings shaking and they self-evacuated. And people with access and functional needs headed for the protected stairwells. Well, for an earthquake, Boston Fire wasn't responding. So we had a lot of phone calls saying, hey, when's somebody going to come and get me? And I think that was definitely a lesson learned. The other hazard area that we talk about is active shooter. And if we'll be doing a training and someone will say, well, I go to the stairwell, right? It's an emergency. And we have to say, well, no, that may not be the best course for you to take. So I think it's an ongoing process of looking at evacuation, you know, different reasons for evacuating. Next slide, please. So our ADA compliance office developed this individual evacuation plan, and basically this is just a tool for the ADA compliance officer to sit down with a member of our community to talk through their personal evacuation plan. It's not something we keep on file. It's just basically an opportunity to sit down and help the person think through their support network, their most likely evacuation routes, and identify any issues or questions that they may have. Next slide, please. So our office manages the campus-wide evacuation plan. And as you can see from the image on the slide, there's our evacuation map. We are on a peninsula and there are challenges that go with it. Our plan imagines a non-vehicular or walking evacuation, if you will, of the campus. And there are two reasons for that. One is that we experience gridlock and mass casualty events, for example. We would want to make sure that first responders are able to reach the campus. The other reason for it is to enable access to the campus for paratransit. There's the second image on the slide is of the MBTA, the ride, which is their paratransit for people with disabilities to access public transportation. So we definitely included in our long list of departments from the campus that participated in the planning effort for this campus-wide evacuation. ADA compliance was definitely at the table and this was considered. Next slide. So when we talk about evacuation and emergencies, it's important to think about how we communicate to people and let them know what protective action that they may want to take, such as evacuation. So with communications and warning, for both fire and our emergency notification systems, we think in terms of alerting via multiple modalities and using visible and audible signals. So for example, if we're going to use our external loudspeakers, we make sure that an accompanying text and email message is sent out via the alert system. Same as with the fire alarms, they flash as well as emit an alerting noise. We have an alert system expansion work group. In higher ed, of course, emergency alerting is very important, and we want to make sure that we are taking advantage of all the evolving technologies that are out there, and we're looking at different ways of spreading the message. And as we're doing that, we're making sure that, you know, we've got our adaptive technology specialist and our ADA compliance officer at the table as we're looking at things like smartphone apps and fire alarm speakers and other devices. Next slide, please. So this brings me to my third and final area of focus, deny entry, closing, and lockdown. College campus, university campus is very difficult to lock down instantaneously. We have so many buildings, and there's just so many different aspects of that. Our technology, at least on our campus, we couldn't issue an immediate lockdown if we wanted to, given the complexity of our buildings. We also have adults on campus who can make their own decisions in terms of whether they stay or leave. So we really embrace the run, hide, fight approach to active shooter threat. The picture on this slide depicts our Office of Student Activities and Leadership. We do trainings both with small departments like this one, and we do larger trainings as well. One benefit of the small group department staff type training like this one is if there's a person with access and functional needs in the group, it allows public safety to talk with the group constructively and creatively in terms of run, hide, fight, what their responses would be, and take into consideration their office setup. In the photo here, you may notice Diane Murphy is sitting at the corner here of the table. She uses a wheelchair. She's a senior bookkeeper in the office. And she was adamant. I asked her, can we use your photo? And she said, definitely use my photo. I'm a real person. She's very grateful that people are paying attention to this, because initially there was a lot of anxiety about, well, what are we going to do? And through this discussion, this is Officer Diane Kirkpatrick from the UMass Boston Police Department, we were able to identify some strategies for Diane and for the rest of the staff. Next slide, please. This is a word cloud graphic that we use. When we talk about run, hide, fight, I think something like this is helpful in terms of, if you think about Diane or somebody else who may feel like, well, run, well, I don't identify with that. This word cloud includes other words that basically say get out. So run, race, bound, escape, basically translated into your own, something that makes sense to you. And I think that that's helpful as we're looking at, dealing with the language that goes with this kind of instruction. At UMass Boston, we also use our full-scale exercises to think about what our instruction should be for people with access and functional needs, and we work very closely with the Institute for Community Inclusion, which I've mentioned before, our Campus Disability Support Office, our ADA specialists, and our local FEMA Region 1 Disability Integration Specialist. Here in Region 1, Kate McCarthy Barnett is fabulous. She's been very helpful to us. Last year we had somebody from the MBTA Transit Authority, Rob Sampson, who does their exercises. He himself uses a wheelchair, and he has a great focus on access and functional needs. His focus is primarily on training their staff and the first responders how to respond to people with access and functional needs in mass casualty events, et cetera. Our focus is much more on the individual and how to empower the individual. So next slide, please. This next slide is about the drill that we did at the Institute for Community Inclusion. Again, thinking in terms of individual empowerment and what we can do to help guide people with access and functional needs for the active shooter threat. We did this drill. It didn't involve the police response part. Our police officer here, Chris Camborian, played the role of the bad guy and basically simulated gunshots. And we did 2 rounds of giving the staff an opportunity to run, hide, and we didn't include fighting. We added that into the training, no fighting, but run or hide. And here there's a photo of research data coordinator Jen Bose and her service dog Nitra. And she was a controller for the first round, and then she wanted to be a participant for the second round. And when I asked her about using her photo, she said, "Don't you have a photo of me running? I'd rather you use that photo." Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of her participation, but she was glad that she participated in it. It was an empowering experience for her. She ran down the hall and took refuge in an office, and she felt that she could protect herself in an active shooter event. The picture below hers is Jonathan Kelleher. He was featured on NPR a couple years back, focusing on his success as an ICI employee. There he is showing Officer Camborian his hiding place. And so we only did 2 rounds of this, and there was an hour-long debrief. It could have gone longer. There was a lot of discussion about, that feeling of you're on your own. And I think it was Jonathan who said, in other different types of emergencies, we wait for other people to help us, but with this, you're really on your own. And so there's this idea of independence, but also teamwork and others being willing to help out, and how to ask for help, whether to offer help. So I think that there was definitely an agreement that more work is needed, and they want to do another drill, which is exciting. So both this drill, we haven't planned a date for that yet, but the one in August is August 26th. If anybody's in the Boston area and wants to join us, please feel free to reach out. Definitely interested, happy to share what we've been doing, but equally interested in learning from others who are out there who have experience doing this kind of stuff. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share what we've been doing at UMass Boston. And I think that's the end of my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Move to the next slide. We're now going to open the webinar up for any questions you may have. And as a reminder, you can submit any questions you have in the Q&A tool. If you'd like to submit questions during this time and are not able to do so via the box provided via Adobe Connect, please email questions to info@wenscacenter.org. Next slide. Akshay, do we have any questions at this time?
We do. Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to our presenters, Jill and Anne-Marie. This first question actually is for Anne-Marie, and it pertains to the personal emergency plan that you just described. Do you have any advice for college or university that may want to create their own resources for individuals with access and functional needs?
Oh, sure. I think that, it's good to start out by connecting with your disability support people and your ADA compliance officer, whoever your campus resources are, and then really looking online. DHS, FEMA, Ready.gov, Red Cross, there's so much out there, especially as it relates to personal preparedness. It really wasn't that difficult to find information, and then, our creative services department helped us with that design, and we were able to tell them, we'd like this to be inclusive. It's not a disabilities guide, it's a whole community guide. And they were able to find some photos that were appropriate, and really it wasn't that difficult to put together. And as I recall, we had the assistance of an English major intern who was helping us locate appropriate text and help with some of the editing and putting things together.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Actually, do you have any other questions?
We do. We actually have a question for Jill. This question pertains to earthquakes and other natural hazards. Jill, how do people who use wheelchairs protect themselves during an earthquake? Would you be able to shed some light on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The protocols are actually called instead of drop, cover, and hold on, it's lock, cover, and hold on. So the person locks the wheels on the wheelchair and then covers as best as they can and holds on to the wheelchair.
Great. Thank you, Jill. Akshay, anybody else? Any other questions? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we actually have a question for Vance. Thank you so much for your presentation, Vance. This question is on collaboration and communication. If a state education agency wanted to work with other state-level departments, how would they go about doing that? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I would recommend that they do that. The collaborative process is going to be key. I think, find out who it is that they want to work with, and they should have somebody that has responsibility for emergency management. If they have a hard time finding that out, they can actually contact my office, but I'm happy to put them in contact with whoever their counterpart would be. That might actually be the simplest route for somebody.
Great. Thank you, Vance. And actually, I think we have time for one more question.
We do. Thank you so much. This question is for Anne-Marie as well. Regarding individual emergency evacuation plans, who is involved in the development of that plan? And also, something that was mentioned in the document, you do not keep on file, but used for planning purposes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Can you elaborate on do not keep on file, please?
Sure. This individual emergency evacuation plan was the work of our ADA compliance office, which is located in our Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And their purpose for developing this form was to provide some kind of framework for a discussion with any individual who might approach them looking for assistance with evacuation. So our ADA compliance officer can sit with the person, help them fill it out, and talk about the concepts in it. The ADA compliance officer may go and look at the person's office space, et cetera, as appropriate, or if the person has questions about the alert system or the evacuation plan, the compliance officer would reach out to the appropriate department. That was a question about whether or not to keep them on file. Now, the evacuation plans for each building that Environmental Health and Safety put together do instruct people to register with the ADA compliance officer for the purpose of having their name included in a document that would go into the fire alarm panel of the building that they're in. This document, the plan document, is different in that it's so detailed, and I think our ADA compliance office said that they did not feel comfortable keeping these on file and trying to try in the midst of an emergency. It would be very difficult given the complexity of our population. We don't have 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 people with disabilities. We have a very diverse population with a lot of people with disabilities. And it was the decision of the ADA compliance office at that time not to keep them on file, to, you know, explain to the person that this was for themselves and their empowerment in terms of thinking through their plan for evacuation, depending on whichever campus building they use.
Great, thank you, Anne-Marie. For the information of everybody, this webinar is going to be archived. It's going to be available within 7 to 10 days on the REMS TA Center's website in the webinar section. Following this webinar, we're going to be having a Twitter chat for about an hour where we'll be answering your questions and sharing information about inclusive planning, imposing for your own. Follow us on Twitter, search for @REMSTACenter, or you can use the hashtag #InclusivePreparedness. Thank you for your time today, and this concludes the webinar.